The grand concert hall was alive with excitement. Golden chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of guests dressed in their finest clothes. The air smelled of polished wood, perfume, and anticipation. It was a night everyone in the city had been waiting for. The night when Leonard Voss, the most famous pianist in the country, would perform live. People whispered his name as if he were royalty. Cameras flashed at the entrance while waiters quietly served drinks to those who could afford the best seats. Everything about that evening spoke of elegance, wealth, and pride. Leonard Voss was a man who loved attention. He had talent, yes, extraordinary talent, but he also had a pride that was even bigger than his skill. Every time he sat at the piano, he expected admiration, praise, and applause. He enjoyed the way people stared at him, the way they whispered, "He's a genius." To him, every concert was not just music. It was a stage where he could prove he was better than everyone else. He believed that music was perfection, and perfection belonged only to him. Backstage, Leonard was preparing himself, adjusting his tuxedo and looking into a mirror with a satisfied smile. His assistant reminded him of the evening's special event, a small charity performance before his own show. "Some children from the music school will play before you," the assistant said. Leonard rolled his eyes. "Children before me? How charming," he said sarcastically. He didn't like sharing the stage, especially not with amateurs. Still, he agreed, knowing it was part of the charity event. He would tolerate it for publicity. As the lights dimmed, the audience grew quiet. The sound of chatter faded away, replaced by soft murmurs of expectation. The announcer stepped onto the stage and spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before Mr. Voss graces us with his performance, we have a few young talents who will share their love for music." The crowd clapped politely. Though most people were only waiting for Leonard, a few children came out one by one, nervous but proud. They played their little tunes, some simple, some out of tune, but all filled with innocence. The audience smiled kindly. Leonard waited behind the curtain, tapping his fingers impatiently, not impressed. Then came the last name on the list, Emily. A small girl appeared from the side of the stage, guided by her mother. She wore a dark red satin dress that shimmered under the stage lights. Her hair was tied neatly in a braid, and she held her mother's hand tightly. As she approached the piano, it became clear she couldn't see where she was going. Her steps were careful, hesitant. The crowd whispered quietly, realizing the girl was blind. A few looked confused. Others looked sympathetic. Leonard raised his eyebrows when he noticed her. He leaned toward his assistant and muttered, "A blind girl? Playing the piano?" His tone was not kind, it was mocking. "This will be interesting," he added with a smirk. He couldn't imagine how a blind child could play the piano properly. To him, it sounded ridiculous. The assistant stayed silent, sensing the arrogance in his tone. Emily reached the piano and gently ran her small fingers across the keys, as if greeting an old friend. Her mother whispered a few encouraging words before stepping back. The hall was quiet again. People watched curiously. Some smiled, hoping she would do well. Others whispered doubts. Leonard folded his arms and waited for the mistake he was sure would come. At that moment, the light from the chandeliers reflected off the white piano, making it glow softly. Emily sat still, feeling the surface of the instrument, counting the keys with her touch. There was something peaceful about her, a calmness that contrasted sharply with Leonard's restless pride. She took a deep breath. She didn't see the crowd, didn't see their judgmental eyes. For her, there was only the piano and the music she carried inside. Leonard, still waiting backstage, couldn't stop himself from chuckling quietly. "They're making a fool of themselves," he said under his breath. But he didn't know that this small girl, this blind child, was about to change everything he believed about music. The audience, though polite, shared his curiosity. Would she really be able to play? Was this just a part of the charity act? Some felt uncomfortable, unsure whether to clap or stay silent. The tension was almost visible, like the pause before a storm. Emily's fingers rested on the keys. The first sound had not yet come, but something about her stillness made people stop whispering. Even the sound of cameras faded away. Her small figure looked fragile next to the enormous white piano, but there was quiet strength in the way she sat. It was as if she belonged there, as if she was born to be part of that instrument. Leonard peeked through the curtain again, his smirk fading just slightly. For the first time that night, he felt something he didn't expect, a small flicker of curiosity. The atmosphere in the hall changed. What had started as a glamorous, pride-filled evening was turning into something else, something deeper. No one knew yet, but the moment was about to become unforgettable. The lights glowed warmly, the air grew still, and every heart in the room waited for the first note that would change everything. The soft sound of the girl's hands brushing over the piano keys made the audience hold their breath. Everyone was waiting for her to start, but Emily sat still for a few moments longer, her small fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't nervous because of the piano. She was nervous because she could feel the weight of so many eyes on her. Even though she couldn't see them, she could sense their doubts. She could feel the silence pressing around her like a wall. From backstage, Leonard Voss watched with a smirk on his face. He whispered something to the man beside him, loud enough for a few people in the front row to hear. Is this some kind of joke? A blind girl playing the piano at my concert? What next? A bird conducting an orchestra? His words were cruel, and though he said them with a laugh, the people who overheard shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one dared to respond. Leonard was famous, too powerful for anyone to correct. Emily's mother, standing near the side of the stage, heard the whisper. Her heart sank, but she didn't say anything. She had seen that kind of arrogance before. People who thought talent only belonged to those who looked perfect. She wanted to tell them that her daughter had practiced day and night, that Emily could hear music in ways no one else could, but she stayed quiet. She trusted her daughter's music to do the talking. The announcer smiled nervously and said, "And now we'll hear a special performance from young Emily, who has prepared a beautiful piece just for tonight." The polite applause that followed was thin and hesitant. It wasn't the warm welcome one might expect for a child. It was the sound of curiosity mixed with disbelief. Leonard leaned closer to the curtain, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see if she can even find middle C." A few people behind him chuckled quietly, not because it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. Leonard's confidence filled the room like a shadow. He was the star. No one dared to challenge him. Emily heard the faint laughter. She didn't know who it came from, but she understood what it meant. She had faced that sound before, the sound of people who didn't believe in her. For a moment, she felt her hands go cold. She thought about the long nights when she practiced in her small apartment, listening carefully to every note. She remembered how her mother would sit beside her and hum along, so that she could feel the rhythm through the floor. She had learned the piano not through sight, but through touch, sound, and heart. The audience sat waiting, whispering softly. Someone muttered, "Poor thing. I hope she doesn't embarrass herself." Another said, "Maybe she'll surprise us." But no one really believed it. Leonard stepped closer to the stage entrance, unable to resist the temptation to watch. He leaned forward and called out, his tone half mocking, half commanding. "Well then, young lady, let's hear what you've got." His voice echoed through the quiet hall. The comment made a few people gasp. The host looked horrified. Emily froze for a second. Her mother clenched her hands together, whispering under her breath, "Ignore him, sweetheart. Just play." Emily took a deep breath. She placed both hands gently on the keys. The familiar touch of the smooth ivory gave her strength. She didn't answer the man's rude tone. She didn't need to, but Leonard wasn't done. "Come on," he said loudly, grinning. "Don't be shy. We don't have all night." A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience, though most people just looked uncomfortable now. They could sense the cruelty behind his smile. The stage lights shone on Emily's face, and a tear formed at the corner of her eye. She didn't want to cry. She wanted to show them what she could do. She wanted the piano to speak for her. Slowly, she wiped the tear away, straightened her back, and whispered softly to herself, "Let them listen." Leonard crossed his arms, still amused. He whispered, "This will be over in a minute." But in truth, a small part of him was curious. What if she really played something? What if she didn't? The room was utterly silent now. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to fade. The only thing that moved was Emily's fingers as she prepared to begin. The moment before the first note felt endless and like the calm before thunder, and then she pressed the first key. A single note, soft and pure, floated through the air. It was followed by another, then another, forming a melody so delicate it felt like a whisper. The hall seemed to hold its breath again. The audience, who had expected clumsy mistakes, now listened carefully. Something about the sound was different. It wasn't loud or showy, it was full of feeling. Leonard blinked. He hadn't expected that. The notes were gentle, but they carried weight, like raindrops that could carve stone. He leaned forward slightly, his grin fading just a little. Emily continued, her hands moving with grace and confidence. The piano keys were no longer cold beneath her fingers. They were alive, responding to her touch. She didn't play for the crowd. She didn't play for the man who had mocked her. She played for the music itself. The audience sat frozen, unable to look away. The laughter was gone now. The mockery had turned into silence. The kind of silence that only comes when something truly powerful begins to unfold. Leonard stood completely still, his confident smile gone. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, shame. And as Emily's song began to fill the room with light and emotion, everyone who had doubted her started to realize that this was no ordinary performance. Something was happening on that stage, something they would remember forever. For a long moment after Emily played the first few notes, the hall remained silent, the kind of silence that makes every breath sound too loud. No one moved. No one spoke. The people who had expected to laugh or whisper now sat frozen, unsure of what they were feeling. The melody floated through the air like a soft wind. It was gentle at first, like the start of a dream. Every note carried warmth, sadness, and beauty all at once. The piano keys seemed to glow under the light, and Emily's small hands moved gracefully, never missing a beat. Her face was calm, but her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. She wasn't reading music. She wasn't following any sheet. She was simply feeling it. From the back of the stage, Leonard Voss watched with narrowed eyes. At first, he tried to hold on to his smirk, but it slowly began to fade. Something about the sound didn't make sense to him. How could a blind child create such perfect timing, such emotion, such connection? He had spent years mastering technique, studying theory, and performing for fame. But this little girl was doing something different. She wasn't showing off. She was living the music. The audience was still silent, though not from boredom or disrespect. It was the kind of silence that comes from awe. People didn't dare cough or whisper. They were afraid to disturb the fragile magic that filled the room. Even the faint creak of a chair sounded too loud. Every heart in the hall seemed to beat in time with Emily's playing. Emily herself didn't notice any of it. She couldn't see the faces, the lights, or the crowd, and that was what made her free. She didn't feel pressure to impress anyone. She was in her own world, a place filled with sound and color that existed only in her imagination. She played with a kind of honesty that couldn't be taught. Each note told a story, and then a story of pain, hope, and courage. Leonard leaned forward, trying to find fault. She must be repeating something she memorized, he muttered to himself, though even he didn't sound convinced. The music was too alive, too spontaneous. It wasn't robotic or rehearsed. It had emotion. It breathed. An old man sitting in the front row wiped a tear from his eye. He didn't know the girl, but the melody reminded him of his late wife, who used to hum the same kind of tune while cooking. A young woman in the audience, who had come only to see Leonard, found herself holding her breath. She had never heard music that felt so pure. Emily's mother, standing near the curtain, covered her mouth with her hand. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she listened. She had heard her daughter play countless times before, but this was different. This time, it felt like the whole world was finally hearing what she had always known. That her daughter's blindness didn't limit her. It gave her a different kind of vision. As Emily played on, the air in the room seemed to change. The chandelier lights looked softer, almost golden. The audience's cold, polite expressions melted into warmth. Some people clasped their hands together. Others leaned forward in disbelief. It felt as if time had stopped. Leonard's pride began to crack like glass. The man who had walked into the concert hall believing no one could match his skill was now watching something far beyond technique. He could play every piece in the book flawlessly, but he realized now that perfection was not the same as beauty. Emily's mistakes, if there were any, didn't matter, because every sound she made carried emotion. The melody shifted. It grew stronger, deeper. It rose and fell like waves on the ocean. Emily's fingers moved faster, then slowed down again as if telling a story only she could see. It was a conversation between her and the piano, one filled with love, longing, and courage. No one could take their eyes off her. The audience didn't know whether to cry or smile. They simply listened. Leonard's hands clenched at his sides. He felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. For the first time, he wasn't the best person in the room. And that realization shook him more than he wanted to admit. When the final part of the melody came, Emily slowed down, her hands trembling slightly from emotion. The notes grew softer and softer until they faded into silence. The last sound echoed for a few seconds like a memory that didn't want to end. Then nothing. The hall was completely still. Not a single clap. Not a single sound. The audience sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The silence wasn't from rejection, it was from disbelief. It was the kind of silence that happens after something extraordinary. Emily turned her face slightly toward the sound of the audience, unsure what to think. Had she done well? Was the silence good or bad? For a moment she felt fear creep back into her chest. Then somewhere in the back, one person began to clap. The sound was soft at first, then louder. Another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. Thunderous, overwhelming applause. People stood from their seats, cheering and clapping, shouting, "Bravo!" and "Magnificent!" Emily smiled shyly. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their warmth. Her mother ran to her and hugged her tightly. Backstage, Leonard stood in the shadows, stunned. The silence that had followed her music had not been awkward after all. It had been sacred, the kind of silence that only true beauty could create. And deep down he knew that his arrogance had been shattered by the small hands of a blind girl who didn't even know she had just changed his life. The sound of applause still echoed through the hall, like waves crashing after a storm. Emily sat quietly on the piano bench, her small hands resting on her lap. She didn't move, didn't speak, she simply listened. The clapping, the cheers, the soft cries from the audience. She could feel all of it through the vibrations in the floor and the air. For the first time in her life, she truly felt seen, even though she couldn't see anyone. Her mother ran to the stage, tears shining in her eyes. She hugged Emily tightly and whispered, "You did it, sweetheart. You did it." Emily smiled gently, her voice soft. "I just played what I felt, Mama." But the performance wasn't over yet. The announcer walked back on stage, wiping his own eyes, and said with a trembling voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that something truly special? Let's hear it again for young Emily." The crowd roared, their applause growing louder. Some people whistled, others shouted her name. Leonard Voss stood in the shadows, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. His chest felt tight. His own concerts were always met with standing ovations, but never with this. What he had just witnessed wasn't technical brilliance. It was something deeper. It was pure heart. Emily turned her head toward the sound of the crowd and spoke softly, "May I play one more piece?" The audience immediately fell silent again. Her mother nodded from the side, and the announcer said, "Of course, dear. Take your time." Leonard frowned, part of him still unwilling to admit his curiosity. He muttered, "Another one? Let's see if that first song was just luck." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Something inside him, pride, ego, or fear, began to tremble. The hall grew quiet once more. The air felt heavy like the moment before rain. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers hovering above the keys. She looked peaceful, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Perhaps the song already playing inside her mind. Then, the first note. It was so soft that it was almost invisible. But it carried weight, a deep emotional power that made every heart in the room pause. The note hung in the air long and pure before melting into the next one. The sound filled the hall like light through glass, fragile, glowing, alive. Leonard felt a strange chill down his spine. He had heard thousands of performances, but this was different. It was as if time had slowed down. Each note seemed to speak, not to the ear but directly to the soul. Emily's hands began to move faster, the melody building like a rising wave. She wasn't reading sheet music or following a plan. She was telling a story of a little girl who had lived her whole life in darkness but still found beauty in sound. Every note was like a step in her journey. Sometimes the melody trembled like fear. Sometimes it soared like hope. The audience leaned forward. Some people closed their eyes just to listen better. They could feel her story. The loneliness, the quiet strength, the hidden light in the darkness. Her music spoke a language that needed no words. Words. Leonard's heart pounded. He couldn't look away. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "How can someone who's never seen the world play it so perfectly?" He felt a mix of envy and admiration, a rare feeling for a man who had always believed he was the best. Emily's fingers moved like water, smooth, flowing, effortless. The piano responded to her touch as though it knew her heart. Each chord shimmered with emotion, each pause filled with meaning. She was no longer just a little girl sitting at a piano. She was the center of the universe, holding every soul in that room in her small, steady hands. The song grew louder now, more powerful, almost triumphant. The audience could feel something rising, something bigger than music. It felt like faith, like forgiveness, like love. And then just as suddenly the music softened again. The storm calmed. Emily's fingers slowed, her touch lighter now like the last drops of rain on a window. The melody began to fade, gentle, peaceful, complete. When the final note came, it was almost a whisper. It floated into the silence, lingered there for a heartbeat, and then disappeared. The hall was quiet once again. No one clapped immediately this time. They just sat there, silent, overwhelmed. Some had tears on their faces. Others stared at the piano as if it had just revealed something holy. Emily sat still, her hands resting on her knees. She couldn't see their reactions, but she could feel it. The warmth in the air, the stillness that followed something true. She smiled softly and whispered, "That one was for my father. He loved the rain." Her mother's tears fell freely now. She covered her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. The audience finally began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the entire room shook with emotion. Leonard remained motionless, his face pale. He didn't clap. He couldn't. His hands stayed frozen at his sides as his mind replayed every note. For years he had believed that perfection was about skill, about speed, precision, and fame. But now he understood something painful and beautiful. Perfection was about feeling. As the crowd rose to their feet, cheering for Emily, Leonard slowly stepped forward from the shadows. He looked at the small girl sitting at the piano, the one he had laughed at, doubted, and mocked. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Leonard Voss, the great pianist, bowed his head in silence, not out of shame alone, but out of respect. The applause went on and on like a storm that refused to end. People stood on their feet, clapping until their palms turned red. Some were crying, others cheering. But no one was the same person they had been before Emily's performance. Something deep had shifted inside everyone in that hall. Emily sat quietly at the piano, her fingers still resting gently on the keys. She didn't move until the sound of clapping slowly began to fade. Then she gave a small bow and smiled, not proudly but shyly, like a child who had just shared a secret. Her mother rushed to her and hugged her tightly, whispering, "You made them feel what I've always felt." Leonard Voss, standing near the edge of the stage, didn't move. His body felt heavy as if his feet were stuck to the floor. The proud, confident man who had entered the concert hall earlier that evening was now completely silent. His hands hung by his sides, his mouth slightly open. He looked lost, not in confusion but in realization. For the first time in years, Leonard didn't know what to say. He had spent his life chasing applause, admiration, and perfection. But now, watching a blind girl play with pure heart, he realized that what he had been chasing was hollow. He had once believed music was about control, perfect timing, flawless notes, and impossible speed. Yet what Emily had done tonight wasn't perfect in a technical sense. It was human, raw, emotional, and that was why it was beautiful. The hall began to quiet again as people sat back down. Leonard took a slow breath and walked onto the stage. The sound of his shoes echoed in the silence. Emily turned her head slightly toward the sound, her expression calm. She didn't seem afraid or proud. She simply waited. Leonard stopped beside the piano. For a moment he couldn't look at her. His throat felt tight and his usual confident voice failed him. He finally spoke, his tone soft, almost broken. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "That was extraordinary." Emily smiled gently. "Thank you, sir." Leonard hesitated, then said quietly, "You played with something I've never heard before." She tilted her head, her blind eyes reflecting the golden light of the stage. "I just played what I feel," she said softly. "The piano listens if you let it." Her words hit Leonard like lightning. The piano listens if you let it. Simple but powerful. He realized he had never truly listened to his own music. He had only performed it. Every concert had been about impressing people, not connecting with them. He looked at the little girl before him. Fragile, innocent, yet powerful enough to humble a man who had once believed himself untouchable. He felt his pride melting away, replaced by a deep, aching respect. "I owe you an apology," Leonard said, his voice quiet but sincere. The audience stirred, surprised. "Before you played, I said some cruel things. I laughed. I doubted you." He paused, struggling to find words. "But you've shown me what real music is. Not something you play with your hands, but something that comes from here." He placed his hand over his chest. Emily's mother wiped away tears as the audience listened in silence. Emily smiled again. "It's okay," she said gently. "Sometimes people need to hear before they can really see." Leonard's eyes glistened. The hall was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the lights above. Then, to everyone's surprise, the great pianist slowly bent down and bowed to the little girl. The audience gasped. Cameras flashed. But Leonard didn't care. For once, he wasn't thinking about fame or image. He was simply a man humbled by truth. When he rose, Emily reached out a hand toward the sound of his breathing. He gently took it, feeling how small and warm her hand was compared to his. "Thank you," he said softly. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." She nodded. "Music doesn't care who you are," she said. "It just wants to be felt." Her words hung in the air like another perfect melody. The audience, deeply moved, began to clap again. But this time, the applause wasn't just for Emily. It was also for Leonard's humility, for the moment of transformation they had all witnessed together. From that night forward, Leonard would never play the same way again. Something inside him had changed, something permanent. He walked off stage slowly, his heart beating faster than it ever had during a performance. When he reached the dressing room, he looked in the mirror. The face staring back at him was the same, yet completely different. The proud man was gone. In his place stood someone softer, wiser, more human. He sat down at a small piano in the corner of the room and placed his hands on the keys. For a long while he didn't play. He just sat there listening to the silence, really listening, as Emily had said, and then almost without realizing it, he began to play. Not a practiced piece, not something written in a book, but something new, something raw. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Outside, the audience still buzzed with emotion. People talked about the blind girl's performance, about how the famous pianist had bowed to her. But Leonard didn't care about the gossip. For him, that night wasn't about humiliation. It was about rebirth. He understood now that music wasn't about being flawless. It was about truth. And sometimes truth comes from the most unexpected places. As his quiet tune filled the empty room, Leonard smiled for the first time in years, a real smile, free of pride, and somewhere down the hall, he could still hear Emily's melody lingering in the air, like a gentle echo reminding him, music doesn't need eyes, only a heart that listens. The crowd was still standing when Leonard left the stage. Their clapping filled every corner of the concert hall. It was not the kind of polite applause people gave out of habit. It was wild, emotional, and alive. It was the sound of heart speaking louder than words. Emily sat on the piano bench, smiling shyly. She couldn't see the people rising to their feet, but she could feel it. The floor beneath her trembled with the rhythm of hundreds of hands coming together. The air was warm, buzzing with energy. For the first time in her young life, Emily truly understood what it meant to be heard. Her mother stood at the side of the stage, crying openly. She had dreamed of this moment since Emily was a child, tapping out little tunes on a toy piano. Back then, people had told her that her blind daughter would never live a normal life, that her dreams were too big. But now, as she watched her child take a bow in front of a roaring crowd, she knew. Emily had not only lived her dream, she had changed the meaning of it. The applause grew louder. People shouted her name, "Emily, Emily," and tossed flowers onto the stage. The bright petals brushed against her shoes and she bent down carefully, touching them with her fingers. "They're beautiful," she whispered, even though she couldn't see their color. Her mother's voice came softly. "They're red and white, sweetheart, and just like your dress." From the corner of the stage, Leonard Voss stepped out again. The crowd's clapping softened a little as they noticed him. His expression was different now. Calm, gentle, almost shy. Gone was the arrogance that once surrounded him like armor. He walked slowly to the piano and stood beside Emily. The lights glowed softly around them, making the moment look almost unreal. Leonard turned to the audience and lifted his hand slightly, asking for silence. The hall fell quiet again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "Tonight you came here expecting to hear me play. But I believe you've already heard something far greater than I could ever offer." The audience stayed still, hanging on every word. Leonard continued, "This young lady has reminded me, and all of us, what true music means. It is not perfection. It is not fame. It is the sound of the soul speaking truth." He turned toward Emily. "You have opened my eyes," he said softly, his voice trembling, "and I thank you for that." Emily smiled in his direction, her milky eyes glistening under the light. "I only played what I felt," she said. "Music helps me see the world." The hall erupted in applause again, louder than before. Leonard looked down, smiling humbly. He took Emily's hand and lifted it into the air. The crowd roared, their cheers echoing through the hall like thunder. Flashlights flickered as photographers captured the moment, the great pianist holding hands with the blind girl who had changed him. It was an image that would later appear in newspapers, magazines, and television screens around the world. But at that moment, it wasn't about fame or stories. It was about connection, one artist recognizing another heart to heart. The conductor of the evening approached and whispered to Leonard, "Would you like to play now?" Leonard shook his head. "No," he said gently. "Tonight belongs to her." Emily turned her face toward him and said softly, "Maybe we can play together?" For a second, Leonard froze. Then he smiled. "It would be my honor." The crowd gasped in delight. The announcer quickly adjusted the microphone, and both of them took their seats at the same piano, the master and the child, side by side. Leonard placed his hands on the lower keys, and Emily's small fingers found the higher ones. He looked at her and said quietly, "You start." She nodded, and the first note floated through the air, that same tender, emotional sound that had silenced the hall before. Leonard joined in softly, his notes weaving around hers like threads of light and shadow. Together, their music filled the hall once more. It was not planned or rehearsed. It was born right there, a spontaneous duet between two souls from different worlds. The audience watched in awe. The sight of the famous pianist following the rhythm of a blind girl's hands was something no one would ever forget. Every note they played was a message of humility, forgiveness, and the beauty of sharing. Emily smiled as she played, her face glowing with quiet joy. Leonard, too, found himself smiling, a real, unguarded smile. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. He was feeling. The music rose strong and bright like sunlight breaking through clouds. When they reached the final note, Leonard let Emily press it alone. The sound rang clear and pure, floating through the hall before fading into silence. And then began the explosion. The audience jumped to their feet, shouting, clapping, crying. The standing ovation was so loud it felt like the walls themselves were applauding. Flowers kept flying onto the stage, and even the orchestra members wiped tears from their eyes. Leonard stood, helping Emily rise. He whispered, "You led and I followed, and as it should be." Emily laughed softly. "No, we played together." The hall filled with cheers once more. The great pianist bowed deeply to the blind girl beside him, and she bowed too, holding his hand. That image, a man who had once mocked, now humbled beside the child who taught him, became a symbol of grace, forgiveness, and the true spirit of art. That night, the applause went on for nearly 10 minutes. When it finally faded, people left the hall still whispering about what they had seen, their hearts full, their eyes wet. They didn't just witness music. They witnessed humanity at its purest, and somewhere deep inside, Leonard knew this would be the night that changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever forgotten what music truly meant. When the concert ended and the applause slowly faded, the hall remained filled with an invisible warmth, the kind that lingers long after the last note. People began leaving their seats, but many stayed behind, still lost in thought. Some hugged, some wiped away tears. The night had given them more than music. It had given them a story, one they would carry in their hearts forever. Backstage, Leonard walked beside Emily, still holding her small hand as the crowd's distant cheers echoed down the corridor. Every few steps, someone stopped him to shake his hand or whisper congratulations, but he only smiled politely. His mind was somewhere else. He wasn't thinking about the applause or the cameras. He was thinking about how a blind girl had just taught him more about music, and about himself, than all his years of fame ever had. Emily's mother followed behind them, her eyes red from crying but her smile bright. "You were wonderful, both of you," she said softly. Emily turned her head toward the sound of her mother's voice and smiled. "Did they like it?" she asked innocently. Leonard laughed quietly, his voice warm. "Emily, they loved it. You made them believe in something real tonight." They entered the dressing room. It was quiet there, just the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of people still clapping outside. Leonard pulled out a chair for Emily and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was peaceful, not awkward. Finally, Leonard spoke, his tone gentle but heavy with emotion. "Emily," he said, "I need to tell you something. When I first saw you tonight, I didn't believe in you. I thought you were just a child with a dream too big. And worse, I laughed at you. I was cruel." Emily tilted her head slightly, listening carefully. "Why?" she asked. He sighed, his hands clasped together tightly. "Because I was proud," he admitted. "I thought music belonged to people like me, people who studied for years, who performed in grand halls, who won awards." "But you proved me wrong." Emily smiled faintly. "Music doesn't belong to anyone," she said softly. "It belongs to everyone who listens." Her words struck him deeply. He looked at her in awe, this small girl who spoke with the wisdom of someone far older. For so long, Leonard had been trapped by his own ego, believing that greatness was something that could be measured. But Emily's music had no measurements, and it was infinite. He stood slowly and walked to the mirror. The man staring back at him looked tired but different. The proud shine in his eyes was gone, replaced by something softer. Humility. He turned back to Emily. "You made me see," he said quietly. Emily tilted her head again, curious. "But I can't see," she said innocently. Leonard smiled sadly. "Maybe not with your eyes," he said. "But you see with your heart, and that's the kind of sight most of us lose." Her mother, standing by the door, covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes again. It wasn't sadness, and it was pride. She had always known her daughter had a gift, but tonight, that gift had reached beyond music. It had touched souls, healed wounds, and softened hearts. Leonard knelt down beside Emily, lowering himself to her level. "I owe you something," he said. "An apology, and a promise." Emily reached out her hand, feeling for him, and gently touched his shoulder. "You already said sorry," she whispered. "What's the promise?" Leonard took her small hand in his. "That I'll never play music the same way again," he said firmly. "From now on, I'll play to feel, not to be perfect. You showed me what that means." Emily nodded, her smile bright. "Then you'll make better music," she said simply. He laughed softly, wiping the corner of his eye. "You're right," he said. "I will." There was a soft knock on the door. A journalist peeked in. "Mr. Voss, people are asking for an interview. They want to know about the girl." Leonard turned toward him and shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about her." The journalist blinked, surprised by the humility in his tone, then nodded and closed the door quietly. Leonard turned back to Emily and said, "You've given me something I can never repay." She smiled. "You already have." "You listened." He froze. Those two simple words hit him harder than applause ever could. You listened. For years he had been the one who demanded to be heard. But Emily was right. He had never really listened. Not to the music, not to others, and not even to himself. Until now. Outside, the last of the crowd began to leave the hall. The cleaning staff moved quietly, sweeping the floor, gathering the flowers that had been thrown onto the stage. One janitor paused for a moment, looking at the piano still sitting there under the lights. "I don't know who that little girl was," he whispered to his co-worker, "but she played like an angel." Back in the dressing room, Leonard gently placed his hand over Emily's and said, "You've changed me." She laughed softly. "Music does that," she said. Leonard smiled, truly smiled. Not the proud, polished smile of a performer, but the peaceful smile of a man who had finally understood something bigger than himself. He knew now that greatness wasn't about being admired. It was about being moved and moving others. That night, when he finally left the concert hall, he didn't feel like a famous pianist. He felt like a student again, a student of life, of humility, of music, and at the center of it all was the memory of a little blind girl who didn't need eyes to make the world see. The night of the concert became more than just a memory. It became a story that traveled far beyond the walls of that grand hall. By morning, newspapers across the city carried the headline, "The Blind Girl Who Taught the World to See." Headline, "The Blind Girl Who Taught the World to See." Photographs of Emily and Leonard holding hands under the stage lights appeared everywhere, on television and magazines, across social media. People who had never cared about classical music suddenly talked about the little girl who made even a famous pianist bow to her. But for Emily and Leonard, that night meant something much deeper than fame. It was not about headlines. It was about hearts. In the days that followed, Leonard could not stop thinking about Emily. The sound of her music replayed in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Every note reminded him of something he had lost long ago, his love for the soul of music. He decided he needed to see her again. A week later, Leonard visited the small apartment where Emily lived with her mother. He brought flowers, white lilies and red roses, the same colors that had been thrown on the stage that night. When Emily's mother opened the door, she smiled warmly. "You didn't have to come," she said. Leonard shook his head gently. "I had to," he replied. "Your daughter changed me." Emily came out from her room, her cane tapping softly on the floor. "Mr. Voss?" she asked, her face lighting up. "You came." Leonard smiled. "I promised I'd listen, didn't I?" They sat together in the small living room. There was no grand piano this time, only a small upright one with chipped paint and slightly uneven keys. But when Emily sat down to play, the same magic filled the air. Leonard closed his eyes, listening. It didn't matter that the room was small or that the piano wasn't perfect. The sound was still beautiful, pure, honest. When she finished, he said softly, "Emily, how would you like to play on bigger stages? Not for fame, but to share this feeling with more people." Emily turned her face toward him. "Only if you play with me," she said simply. And so he did. Months later, they performed together again, not in a fancy city hall, but in a children's hospital. The audience was small, kids in wheelchairs, nurses, parents holding little ones in their arms. Emily played softly, choosing a gentle tune that made everyone in the room smile. Leonard played beside her, following her rhythm, letting her lead. When they finished, there were no loud cheers this time, only quiet, heartfelt clapping, and the sight of children smiling through their pain. After the concert, a small boy approached Emily. He was about 6 and his eyes were covered with bandages. "I can't see either," he said shyly. "But I heard your music. It felt like sunshine." Emily knelt beside him and held his hand. "That's what music is," she said softly. "Sunshine you can hear." Leonard watched, his heart full. He realized that Emily didn't just play music and she gave it away like light. Years passed. Emily grew older and her name became known around the world. She performed in great halls, small schools, hospitals, and open-air concerts. Everywhere she went, she brought warmth and emotion that no stage lights could match. She always said the same thing in interviews. "I play so people can listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts." Leonard continued to perform too, but now his music had changed completely. His pieces were gentler, filled with feeling. He no longer played for applause. He played to connect. He even started teaching again. And in every class, he told the story of the blind girl who had shown him what music really was. "Perfection means nothing without emotion," he would tell his students. "Play like Emily. Play so that people feel you." One evening, years later, Leonard sat alone in his home, now older and grayer. On his piano rested a framed photo of that unforgettable night, him holding Emily's hand on stage. He looked at it and smiled. He began to play a soft tune, one that sounded like rain on glass, Emily's melody. As the notes filled the room, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, little one, for teaching me how to see." Meanwhile, Emily, now a young woman, was performing across the ocean. She sat at a grand piano wearing a simple red dress. The lights dimmed and the hall fell silent, just like all those years ago. Before she began, she spoke softly into the microphone. "This song is for my first teacher, the one who showed me that hearts can change." Then she pressed the first key, that same note that had once made a room full of people fall silent. The melody flowed out full of light and emotion. It was both a memory and a promise, a song that would never end. Somewhere far away, Leonard stopped playing at the same moment, as if he could hear her across the distance. A small tear rolled down his cheek, but he was smiling. He didn't need to be in the crowd to listen. He could hear her perfectly in his heart, and so, their music lived on. Two souls forever connected through the invisible language of sound. People still tell the story of that night, the night when a proud pianist mocked a blind girl, and the blind girl's music made the world see. Because sometimes it takes someone who can't see to teach everyone else how to truly listen.